In the Arizona desert, a detective needs to link a murderer to a crime scene. The only witnesses are two bean pods. A grotesque murder on a quiet beach has police baffled. A forensic geologist hopes to transform a spoonful of sand into a witness for the prosecution. After years of hunting for a clandestine grave, the only thing binding a killer to his victim is a tree root. In the past, rural landscapes have offered safe haven to murderers hoping to keep their crimes concealed. Now, thanks to the burgeoning fields of forensic botany and geology, the killer who puts his faith in nature's silence sows his own seeds of destruction. The Sonoran Desert. How many lives have been brutally ended in desolate landscapes like this one, with only an audience of trees to bear witness? Today, those unlikely observers are gaining a voice with which to expose the guilty. The Caterpillar Proving Grounds outside of Phoenix, Arizona, was a thrilling diversion for a man heading home one Sunday in May 1992. Cutting through a dry wash, he was struck by something out of place in the raw landscape. He moved in for a closer look. Face down, beneath a canopy of Palo Verde trees, lay the nude body of a woman. She wasn't breathing. Officers from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene. From the condition of the body, it appeared the victim had been murdered within the last 12 hours. Her clothing was scattered nearby. Braided wire and shoelaces were wrapped around her wrists and ankles. It seemed the killer had spent some time with the victim before leaving her here. Detective Charlie Norton led the investigation. The victim was identified by her fingerprints as 30-year-old Denise Johnson. She'd been arrested for prostitution. Hours passed as the team pored over the crime scene. They hoped to weave tatters of evidence into the coherent narrative of a homicide.
She had a white t-shirt, just an undershirt, was wrapped around her neck, and it looked like maybe she had been strangled.
As the team examined the torn clothes for clues, a fundamental piece of the puzzle came like a plea from beyond the grave. The insistent beeping from a pager broke the silence of the desert. Was some friend, unaware of Johnson's fate, trying to reach her? Or was this the forgotten property of a careless killer? A court order was obtained and the pager company contacted. The owner of the pager was traced through its ID number.
The pager subscriber was a fellow by the name of Earl Bogan, and he said that his son Mark had exclusive use of the pager because he didn't have any telephone communication, and basically that was the only way that the family had to get in touch with Mark.
While police processed the crime scene, a man came forward with a statement. At 1:30 the previous morning, he'd noticed something odd, a white pickup truck with amber clearance lights, whipping out of the proving grounds. The driver ran a stop sign, then flew toward the interstate. Combined with the pager information, this eyewitness testimony would give Norton a leg up on the investigation. When Norton learned that Mark Bogan owned a white pickup truck with amber clearance lights, it seemed to him he found the killer. He would now have to prove it. Bogan, accompanied by his wife Rebecca, agreed to be interviewed at the sheriff's department. In an interview with police, recreated here, Rebecca said that on the night of the murder, Mark came home at 2 a.m., his face bloodied and scratched. He told Rebecca he'd been in a bar brawl. But Bogan told police a different story. He claimed he'd picked up a hitchhiker who fit Denise Johnson's description and had sex with her in his truck. Bogan admitted lying to his wife because he knew she'd be disgusted with the truth. The story was coming together a bit too neatly for Norton, and he wondered whether Bogan was twisting the facts to fit the evidence.
And I think somebody made contact with him and told him that the sheriff's office investigators were looking for him. So I think that kind of basically tipped him off, and he came up with this story.
According to Bogan, after their encounter, he and the hitchhiker argued. He ordered her out of the truck, and as she left, she swiped his wallet and pager. Bogan chased her and fought to recover the wallet. He claimed to have left Johnson on the side of the interstate, alive. Norton suspected that Bogan was telling only half the story.
I suspect probably that what Mark told me when I interviewed him, as far as picking her up, having an argument and so forth like that, I suspect all that's probably true. But the part that he left out is where it happened and that he ended up killing her.
Norton believed that Bogan was a murderer, but he wasn't getting any help from the suspect. Not only did Bogan adamantly deny killing Denise Johnson, it had been years, he claimed, since he'd even stepped foot in the Caterpillar proving grounds. Bogan's admission that he had spent the evening with Denise Johnson would, ironically, make it more difficult to prove that he had killed her.
We got nothing on this guy. Everything that he's told us shuts down all of our whole case. He had sex with her, he knows who she is, the whole shooting match.
Bogan's story, spotty as it was, had just defused an arsenal of forensic weaponry. DNA analysis of body fluids or fingernail scrapings could only prove something which Bogan had already admitted. On the evening of May 2nd, 1992, he and Denise Johnson had sex, then fought. Norton's only hope of bringing Bogan to justice would be to link him to the scene of the crime, a little patch of grass under a cluster of Palo Verde trees in the proving grounds. Bogan's truck was seized and searched, but nothing linking Bogan to Johnson's death was found. 2 seemingly unexceptional Palo Verde seed pods were collected from the truck bed. But thousands of these trees grow in southern Arizona. The pods could have come from anywhere. It hardly seemed like the kind of evidence that could tie a man to a murder. Struggling for a way to link Bogan to the crime scene, Detective Norton returned to the proving grounds. Then, inspiration struck. Noticing a Palo Verde tree with a fresh scrape on it, he theorized that after dumping Johnson's body, Bogan's truck had brushed this tree, causing the pods to flutter free and land in his truck bed. If DNA testing could prove that the pods in Bogan's truck matched the scarred tree, Norton and his colleagues would be able to dismantle Bogan's alibi. But there was a problem. The test they envisioned had never been done before. To catch a killer, Detective Norton approached Timothy Helenjaris, Associate Professor of Molecular Genetics at the University of Arizona. Norton wanted to determine whether there was enough variability in Palo Verde DNA to distinguish one tree from another.
When I was contacted by the Sheriff's Department, they told me that they had some pods that were collected from the truck, and they thought they might have matched one of the trees at the site. They did remark that one of the trees had scrape marks, and so they had one particular tree in mind. So I asked them to collect pods from all the trees around the sites, but not to tell me which one was marked, and just to number them so it would be a blind study.
Using a cutting-edge technique called rapids for randomly amplified polymorphic DNA, Helenjaris rendered genetic profiles of sample trees and pods. The results were surprising. Palo Verde DNA appeared to be as complex as the human code. It seemed that individual trees could be easily distinguished from one another. Dr. Helenjaris first confirmed that the pods from Bogan's truck were from the same tree. He then compared that profile with DNA profiles from a lineup of 11 trees at the crime scene.
When we then informed the Sheriff's Department of which numbered tree it was, it turned out to be the one that in fact had the scrape marks on it that they were suspicious of to start with. So we felt pretty confident with our result there.
The noose was tightening around Mark Bogan's neck. He was arrested and a court date set. Armed with Helenjaris' findings, the prosecution was eager to confront the defendant with the silent testimony of a Palo Verde tree. But Bogan wasn't going down without a fight. To convict Mark Bogan of killing Denise Johnson, the prosecution hung their case on the admissibility of rapids, a legally unproven procedure. DNA analysis of humans had only been deemed admissible in Arizona courts a few months earlier. Using plant DNA to prove murder would be a stretch, and yet the entire case hinged on it. Bogan's defense team hired its own expert, Paul Keim of Northern Arizona University, to refute Helenjaris' findings in a pretrial hearing. If Keim could cast doubt on the validity of Helenjaris' technique, Bogan would likely walk out of court a free man.
So I think that the Bogan family hoped that my expert advice, expert opinion on the new DNA fingerprinting method that was being employed here would say that this was not a valid approach to forensic science, and that this was not conclusive evidence that their son had been at the crime scene. Hey, Jim,
though he was brought into the case as a hired gun for the defense, Dr. Keim's loyalty was to science and the responsible use of laboratory testing. His mistrust about rapids was valid. Since its debut, the new technique had been known to give false readings if the extremely careful controls aren't maintained throughout testing.
In my opinion, it meant that we had to hold it up to a very high standard of scrutiny, and so that it was important that we understood everything that was done here and that it was done correctly.
When performed with extreme care, Rapids provides researchers with an amazing new tool: the ability to look at an organism's DNA without any prior information about that species' genetic composition. The first step in the process is to get the DNA out of the pods. The seeds must be removed for accurate testing. Each represents a mixture of the tree's genetic material with the pollen that fertilized it, and would therefore introduce separate DNA into the test. Liquid nitrogen instantly freezes the pod so that it can be easily pulverized. Once it has been purified, the DNA is ready for PCR gene amplification. This heating process increases a minute sample of DNA to provide technicians with ample genetic material for testing. When reconstituted with water, the seed pod's DNA will be invisible to the eye, but extremely revealing in other ways. The Palo Verde sample is now ready to yield its genetic fingerprint. In order to make that pattern visible, a process called gel electrophoresis is used. Blue dye is added to the DNA sample, which is then inserted into the lanes on a jello-like slab. Exposure to an electrical field causes the fragments in the DNA to separate. The resulting barcode is then illuminated with UV light and photographed. When hired by Bogan's defense team, Keim had been skeptical about Rapid's ability to conclusively differentiate between Palo Verde trees. But when he studied Dr. Helenjaris's data and the painstaking process by which he collected it, he was surprised at how definitive the results were. Influenced by his colleagues' findings, Keim was won over to the prosecution's side, and under oath, he couldn't refute the results. In Keim's opinion, the tree and the pod matched to a great degree of certainty. The defense team now faced an insurmountable setback by the researchers' fidelity to science. Bogan was going down.
When I examined the scientific evidence, the first thing that was most obvious to me is that the DNA from the pod that was found in Bogan's truck did in fact have exactly the same DNA fingerprint pattern as one of the trees where the body was found.
Helenjaris and Keim had placed Mark Bogan at the crime scene. After he had killed Denise Johnson, Bogan backed his truck into a tree and shook loose the evidence that would later convict him. The unrefuted genetic findings decimated the foundation of Bogan's defense. Bogan was convicted of murder and sent to prison for life. Helenjaris's trailblazing research established botanical DNA profiling as an effective forensic tool, giving a voice to two tiny seed pods without whose testimony a murderer would still be walking among us. A world away from the Arizona desert, New England's coastline can be as desolate a place to die as the barren Sonora landscape. But like those seemingly inconsequential Palo Verde pods, grains of sand can be made to talk. On the morning of June 30th, 1994, a woman and her two nephews roamed Crescent Beach in Rhode Island. Buried treasure was the children's goal. What they found instead seemed to have been buried alive. Detective Arthur Clark of the East Providence Police Department was called to investigate the buried woman at the beach. The scene was more reminiscent of a Stephen King novel than anything the veteran detective had seen in person. 2 feet beneath the surface lay a woman in a red satin cocktail dress. Her life had been ended by multiple blows to the head.
We arrived on the scene about 10:15. We verified they were human arms. It appeared a body was buried in a shallow grave. We notified the medical examiner's office, who responded.
The victim's arms jutted out from beneath the sand, her hands clawing skyward in what seemed a final grasp for life. It seemed unlikely that she'd been buried alive. The medical examiner concluded that in her condition, the victim wouldn't have the strength to push her hands up through the sand. Someone had posed her into this final gesture like a scene from a horror film. The killer seemed to be leaving a calling card, but his message was inscrutable. A circular pattern had been pressed into the sand around the body. In it lay a shattered watch face, its hands frozen at midnight. But for detectives, time raced forward. It seemed that some sort of grotesque ritual was performed here. They feared it could be the beginning of killings to come. They needed to work quickly before this killer struck again. At this early stage of investigation, vital clues might be masquerading as common trash. Cigarette butts, candy wrappers, and plastic cups were collected from the scene, along with samples of sand from both the surface and the bottom of the grave.
At the time, we didn't know what was evidence and what was not. So on the side of caution, we collected what we thought could end up being evidence.
Once we put the tape out, there's been nobody else in the area.
But before Clark could make sense of the eerie spectacle, he'd have to learn more about the victim. He didn't have to look far.
At around 8 o'clock that evening, a gentleman by the name of Christopher Hutter, who lived in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, called the Pawtucket police to report his wife missing.
The missing woman was 30-year-old Kendra Hutter. From a photograph, Clark recognized her as the murder victim. According to her husband, Kendra and he had lived more like roommates than lovers. Beyond the facade of domestic contentment dwelt a loveless marriage, bound together by financial need and parental obligation. They agreed to date other people. Christopher Hutter told police that Kendra had a date the night she died. Police later learned she met him through a personal ad. The divorced white male described himself as a cheerful, attractive father. Hoping to add a dash of romance to her life, she contacted him and they arranged for a date. On the night of June 29th, Kendra scribbled the man's name and phone number for her husband. The card read, Gary. Detective Clark identified Gary as Gary Tassone, a truck driver who lived with his mother and brother in Cumberland. He told police that he'd had 3 dates with Kendra Hutter, but denied having been with her on the night of her murder. The personable Tassone did his best to help Clark, telling police that he knew Kendra and her husband were having marital trouble. He suggested that perhaps the disgruntled Christopher Hutter was the murderer. When Tassone told Clark he'd been to the beach where the body was found, Clark asked him to come to the station to continue questioning.
After taking his first statement, there were several things that didn't jive. There were some inconsistencies in what he told us and what we had learned up until then.
In an interview with police, recreated here, Tassone adamantly denied having been with Kendra Hutter the night of the murder. As the interview wore on, however, he revised his story. He admitted he'd been on a date with her that night, but dropped her off around 11 o'clock. But that contradicted what Kendra's husband reported. According to him, Kendra never made it home that night. As far as they could tell, Tassone was the last person to see the victim alive. The detectives pressed on.
Detective Bilodeau and I spoke to him on and off for about 4 hours that evening. He never displayed any signs of emotion. He spoke very well. He was articulate, polite, cool, calm. He was not nervous at all. Pretty just matter of fact.
Clark continued to question Tassone, and as the interview moved into its 5th grueling hour, Tassone finally offered up an account. He and Kendra had been building sand castles when a noise startled him, causing him to inadvertently strike her in the head. In a panic, he buried the body in the sand. Considering the extent of Kendra Hutter's injuries, 7 strikes to the head, Clark rejected the story. There was no question in the detective's mind that the victim was killed intentionally.
What is it? What's wrong?
We don't know why she was murdered, but it was no accident.
On the surface, it seemed that Tassone was beginning to cooperate, but his statement made no sense, and Clark didn't know what to make of it. The tale he told of accidental death was far-fetched and implausible, but probably reflected a skewed version of what really happened. From what Clark had already learned of the case, Tassone was sprinkling his narrative with blatant lies. The resulting story was more confusion than confession. If only Clark could sift through the fantasy and get to the truth, he'd have the case sewn up. For now, Clark had to follow along and see where Tassone would take him. Under the guise of cooperation, the suspect led police to a roadside embankment where he said he ditched the shovel. It seemed like just another delay tactic, but a shovel did indeed turn up. With this discovery, the evidence seemed to be stacked on Clark's side. He had a murder victim buried in a ritualistic fashion. He had the alleged murder weapon. He had a suspect who could link the two together. But Clark only had Tassone's unlikely story to place him at the crime scene. To make the charges stick, he needed to construct a more coherent account of what happened. Armed with a warrant, police searched Tassone's car. The findings were slim, amounting to little more than a scattering of sand. It seemed Clark had found all the evidence there was to find. It was time to go to court. But at the start of the criminal trial in January of 1997, Tassone began to backpedal. Claiming to have been coerced into confession in exchange for immunity, Tassone recanted his story and explained away the sand in his trunk as having come from an evening with another woman at the beach. The shovel, he said, was just a shovel. Police couldn't disprove it. Suddenly, Detective Clark found the tide was turning against him. Without Gary Tassone's confession, Detective Clark and the Rhode Island police had to treat the case as if they'd never had a confession at all. To link Tassone to the crime scene, Clark needed solid evidence, but all he had was a handful of sand. Clark knew the answer was written here, but he wasn't able to read it. To build a case on such unusual evidence was beyond the resources of his small department. He had to call in the experts. He sent the physical evidence to the FBI's Forensic Geology Lab, the only one of its kind in the country. There, geologist Bruce Hall examined the shovel, the blanket, debris from the crime scene, and the sand recovered from Tassone's vehicle.
The contributor, East Providence, Rhode Island, asked that we compare any soil or sand recovered from any of those items with some known samples of sand that they had recovered from the crime scene. In this situation, it was a beach.
To see the past in a grain of sand, that is Hall's mission. Each grain is a world unto itself, differing not only across continents, but across the length and breadth of a shoreline as well. Every child knows that sand on the surface of a beach is different from sand below. But what few criminals realize is that these differences can be measured and compared.
We have known soil samples from the grave. We have some, because it is a grave, we're dealing in 3 dimensions. We have some that were taken a number of different locations on the surface of the earth. As now we have a profile, if you will. We've got a hole in the ground that may be 1, 2, 3 foot deep. We have a number of samples now from various depths.
If the grains of sand found in the suspect's car came from the bottom of the excavated grave rather than the beach surface, as Tassone claimed, Hall would soon find out. To catch Tassone, Hall concentrated on the sand samples taken from the bottom of the victim's grave. If sand on any of Tasson's possessions matched it, Clark would have his case. Geologic examination takes a three-pronged approach. Samples are compared according to color, texture, and composition. The analysis begins with a careful look at color. This first test requires no sophisticated equipment, but it's essential for ruling out samples that would have no bearing on Tasson's case.
We view these under a number of different lighting conditions, daylight, again, fluorescent light, incandescent light, and compare their color. This soil representing soil recovered from the shovel, dissimilar to that collected from the beach. The blanket, again, at arm's length, we can see there's a color difference. This soil did not originate from the same source as the known soil. However, when we take a look at the soil from a vehicle, they're strikingly similar with respect to color.
The color comparison demonstrated that, judging from the sand grain evidence, the shovel may not have been involved in the crime. Or Tasson may have used it elsewhere before ditching it. It seemed like just another red herring Tasson threw out to get police off his scent. Tasson won that battle, but not the war. The sand from his car matched the color of the sand collected from the bottom of the grave. Hall moved on to phase 2 with this sample, analyzing texture. The sand is rinsed with water and exposed to ultrasonic waves, which vibrate off any silt or clay clinging to the sample. The sample is dried and placed under a stereo microscope. Now, Hall looks at the size and texture of the grains. A well-sorted sample consists of same-sized grains, like table salt, whereas a poorly sorted sample contains a variety of sizes, like a can of mixed nuts. Hall also looks at the shapes of the individual grains. Are they round, angular, or oval, for example? In the sand from Tasson's car, the grains were mixed consistently. The sample was said to be well sorted and made up of well-rounded grains. So was the sample taken from the bottom of the grave. The walls were closing in on Gary Tasson, but Hall still had one more test to perform. He examined the soil samples under a polarized light microscope to determine their mineral composition. Different minerals have different optical properties when exposed to polarized light. These characteristics enable Hall to identify them.
Characterizing minerals is fundamentally no different than characterizing an individual. How tall is that individual? How much do they weigh? What is their hair color, eye color? And you characterize a mineral in the same fashion.
The sample from Tasson's trunk was composed predominantly of quartz, with a small amount of the mineral feldspar. When he looked at the sand from the bottom of Kendra Hutter's grave under the same conditions, he found the samples matched. Bruce Hall had now proven that Gary Tasson was in fact with Kendra Hutter on the beach the night she died. And, more than that, he proved that Tasson buried her body. Based largely on the strength of Bruce Hall's forensic evidence, the jury found Gary Tasson guilty of first-degree murder. He is serving a life sentence without parole. The strange man had lured a woman from the personal ads, beaten her in the head with a shovel almost 20 times, and buried her in a way sure to be noticed. The motive and meaning of his crime remain a mystery. Also unknown is whether this was the first strike of Gary Tasson. As he drove his truck across the country, did he place ads in other papers, luring unsuspecting women like Kendra Hutter to their deaths? Or was his first victim also his last? Though the grave markers may be erased by time, nature doesn't forget death. The world is forever changed for the family of a murder victim. The same holds true for the landscape in which a body is buried. 20-year-old Cher Elder was known around the Denver suburb of Lakewood, Colorado as having a mind of her own. It didn't make for smooth relationships. On the evening of March 27, 1993, she had a skirmish with her boyfriend, Byron Powers. No doubt apologies follow after a few hours of downtime. To blow off some steam, Cher caught a ride to Central City, a seedy gambling town 1 hour's drive into the Rockies. Her escort, an older man, was good company, and her moodiness lifted as the night wore on. At 1:40 the next morning, Cher and her companion left the casino. She would soon join the ranks of the missing. Days passed with no sign of Cher. Her frantic father reported her missing to the Lakewood Police Department. Detective Scott Richardson was assigned to the case. Missing person cases are a tricky call. Richardson didn't want to throw his department's resources behind a massive search, only to find that the time and energy had been misspent on a girl who'd left town to cool off.
It's a tough investigation. How involved do you want to get on a missing person case, and how complex do you want to make a missing person case to find out they're laying out on the beach in Maui somewhere?
Richardson had a bad feeling, however, that Cher wasn't on vacation. His first objective was to identify the man with whom she'd last been seen. A surveillance camera at the casino had captured his image.
We did not know who that male was, and that was the last time she was seen alive. A friend of hers had seen her in the casino with this male.
The man was identified as Thomas Luther, an acquaintance of Cher's boyfriend, Byron Powers. Cher had been introduced to the older man shortly before her unlucky gambling trip to Central City. The more he learned about Thomas Luther, the more Richardson sensed that he was no longer looking for a missing person. He was now looking for a body. In Thomas Luther, Cher had picked the wrong shoulder to cry on. A known sex offender, Luther was fresh off a 10-year prison sentence for attacking and raping a young woman. He had bragged in jail that when he got out, the police wouldn't find the next woman he killed. This time, he'd be sure to bury the body where it would never be found. Richardson set out to foil that plan.
Our focus of the case at that time was to try to find the body of Cher Elder for two reasons. We needed it for prosecution and the family.
Richardson questioned Luther, who claimed that after leaving the casino, he dropped Elder off at her boyfriend's house. Luther's car was seized and searched for evidence, but nothing suggesting murder was found. For weeks, Richardson pressed on. Though he had very little hard evidence, knowing that this girl's body was out there somewhere kept the detective searching. To outsmart a clever criminal like Luther, Richardson would need to raise the suspect's level of uneasiness, hopefully compelling him back to the gravesite for a cautious once-over.
The prior day, I called Luther up at home and intentionally meant to sound really confident. I told him, hey, we got some evidence and I want you here at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, hoping that it would increase his anxiety and he would make a mistake.
Richardson succeeded in flushing his quarry out of the brush. An informant told him that Luther planned to return to the grave early the following morning. If the body had been dug up, he planned to flee the state immediately. Meanwhile, undercover officers cast a wide net over the metropolitan Denver area, tailing Luther's acquaintances and scouting major roads. The morning of his meeting with Richardson, police observed a man in a car parked beside the road. Soon, police saw Luther emerge from the woods and get into the car. He proceeded to his meeting with Richardson, cocky with the knowledge that his pursuer was bluffing. Without a body, Richardson couldn't hold Luther. He was bound by law to release him and his car. Months passed without any progress on the case. Meantime, the prime suspect moved out of state. With each passing day, the more likely it seemed that Cher Elder's demise would forever remain a secret between the killer and the victim. The only thing keeping Richardson going was the faith that Cher Elder was buried somewhere in Empire Valley. But finding her in the craggy lowland would be an arduous task.
This valley is about 15 miles in length. And as you get out here, when you start looking for a possible location of the grave, it's nothing but rock slides and piles of rocks. And there's so many potential areas that a body could be hidden in that it just became a maze.
Weeks of foraging around Empire Valley left detectives empty-handed and frustrated. Finding Cher Elder's body in this rough terrain required a kind of expertise that would tax the resources of almost any police department.
Was any good? Yes. Hopefully we would.
Aware that he'd reached his department's limits, Detective Richardson was running out of options. But he wasn't quite ready to throw in the towel. The relentless detective had one final inspiration. He contacted NecroSearch, an elite corps of scientists that uses a wide range of disciplines to locate clandestine graves.
NecroSearch exists because a group of law enforcement officers and scientists got together and figured there had to be a better way to find murdered or buried people and evidence.
Towards that goal, NecroSearch has assembled leading scientists from all over Colorado, comprising 15 specialties, including botany, geology, geophysics, forensic anthropology, and entomology.
53972.
The fundamental premise of NecroSearch is that buried bodies change the ecosystem around them forever. The soil above a grave may sag under rain or snow. Specific vegetation may flourish on the decomposing body.
53969.
Insects and scavengers arrive.
This is a case of a lifetime. This took everything that we had, everything that we could use of other sources from other agencies. That's why NecroSearch was requested to come in and assist. It was real simple. We're a largely populated community here. We're in the metro Denver area. We don't have expertise in going out looking for graves. We don't have very many graves dug in the city.
So far, the all-volunteer NecroSearch team has participated in over 100 cases in 30 states and 7 countries. The group convenes monthly to review potential cases. For most petitioners, like Detective Richardson, NecroSearch represents a final glimmer of hope.
I was asked by NecroSearch to come to their meeting and present the case to see if it was something that NecroSearch could assist me in. And so the case presentation was made to NecroSearch at that time. And boy, they asked me questions that I'd never thought of, such as what color was the dirt on Luther's pants when he came to get his car, because that may indicate he crawled out of a mine shaft or he may have been in a sand pit. And it was pretty apparent right then that when I contacted NecroSearch, these are the people that can help me because they have the experience in trying to locate a grave.
The rocky terrain hampered the endeavor, making disturbances in the soil difficult to spot. The team probed the earth for clues undetectable to the human eye.
On the geology side, we're looking for disturbances in the layering. And everything is layered. You wouldn't think so, but you come out here, you dig down a few feet, you'll find various layers within the rock, or within the soil. And we're looking to see where that's been disturbed.
Ground sweeps, aerial searches, and infrared analysis ruled out many potential grave sites. But still, as the months passed, no body was found. It seemed like Thomas Luther's boast about outsmarting police was coming true. In late January of 1995, a tip led Detective Richardson and NecroSearch to a steep, piney slope off the highway. Rocks covered most of the area. A grave could be disguised anywhere. NecroSearch did some preliminary testing of the location, but were shut down because of weather. It was now nearly 2 years after Cher's disappearance.
You don't like me and I don't like you, and that ain't no...
Then a crucial break came. Byron Powers, Cher's boyfriend, landed in prison for assault. It seemed Cher had a fatal lapse of judgment in her choice of companions. In an effort to lessen the charges against him, Powers dangled a piece of information in front of the police. He said he knew that Luther had killed Cher Elder, and he knew where he'd buried her body. Powers had been there about 3 weeks after Cher's death to help Luther better conceal the grave. Powers directed Richardson right past the point where the NecroSearch team had given up. Unlike most killers who hastily dump bodies downhill, Luther had taken his time in selecting a grave that would seem an improbable choice to police.
What we ultimately learned is that Thomas Luther carried the body of Cher Elder straight up a hillside by a rock slide and went uphill, which is uncommon.
The pile of rocks that Powers pointed out was less than a foot from the place that Richardson and NecroSearch had been testing shortly before the weather had forced them to quit.
We were 2 inches from the body of Cher Elder when we quit digging the first time. We went back, excavated to remove the body of Cher Elder.
As if setting up an archaeological excavation, the team established a grid and embarked upon an old-style dig. Laboriously, the team scraped soil 10 centimeters at a time. Archaeologist Steve Ireland was part of the search for Cher Elder's remains.
There, the initial 2 or 3 inches of ground was frozen. It was, January or February, as I recall. And so there we had to use a pick in order to get that top couple of inches, which was frozen off.
After 4 days and 2 feet of digging, the team reached bone. Excavated with fine hand tools like whisk brooms, toothbrushes, and bamboo sticks, the remains of a body finally took shape in the frozen soil. Dental records would identify the body as Cher Elder. Preliminary autopsy results showed that the young woman had been shot in the head 3 times, execution style. This discovery might have been enough evidence to convince a jury that Luther had killed Elder. But prosecutors would have a much better chance if they knew the time of death. If the body had been buried at least 2 years ago, a time when Cher was known to have been with Luther, the charge of murder would be much easier to prove in court. The team's careful excavation uncovered a clump of plant roots growing into the victim's soft flesh. NecroSearch called in botanist Vicki Trammell to extract and preserve them. Could she determine the time of burial from this botanical evidence?
When digging is done and roots are cut, this stimulates growth of new roots into the fresh backfill dirt. So the idea was that these roots ought to be about the same general age as the grave.
In order to determine the age of the new growth, the roots were sent to a lab where they were cut crosswise and stained, highlighting the characteristics of the cells. Most woody species of trees, like the pines and firs that forested the area near the victim's grave, form their roots in the same way, and the new roots have a particular pattern of cells that can be recognized under the microscope. Most of the differences involve the xylem, which is the water-conducting tissue in the plant.
And what I'm seeing is the water-conducting tissue kind of in a triangle. And it's the triangle shape that tells me that that is a very young root, about a first-year root.
Another year's growth sees a significant change in the cells. The triangle of tissue gives way to larger water-conducting cells.
This tells me it's a secondary root.
From their cellular structure, Trammell estimated the roots to be 2 years old. Her findings sealed the case against Thomas Luther, proving the grave was dug at a time after he was released from jail and known to be with the victim. In the end, a jury was convinced that Thomas Luther killed Cher Elder. He was sentenced to 48 years in prison with no chance of parole. Thanks to the tireless pursuit of Scott Richardson and the cutting-edge forensics of the NecroSearch team, the odyssey had finally come to an end.
I myself don't believe in what they call closure. I believe if you lose a loved one, that you will feel that loss for the rest of your life. But at least if they know what happened, they possibly can get on with their life in some way.
After the case ended, NecroSearch paid Detective Richardson the ultimate honor and inducted him into their selective ranks. Without his determination, Cher Elder would still be hidden in a desolate grave. The Earth is an impartial eyewitness to murder. But forensic botany and geology are finding ways to gather its testimony. Crimes considered unsolvable a few years earlier are now being won on the basis of roots, seeds, and sand. The landscape has become grounds for conviction, but we've only begun to scratch the surface. Investigators hoping to solve a difficult murder case have a creeping suspicion about who did it. But to catch the killer, they must first trap their witnesses. Detectives at the scene of a young woman's murder learn that the best tool to capture her killer may be a dustpan. Everyone's a suspect when a woman is murdered in her hotel room.
God, what's happening?
Investigators look to the killer's own hand to prove his guilt. In the absence of human bystanders, sometimes insects or even microbes can provide the most objective testimony. When death doesn't come by natural causes, solving it often depends upon a natural witness.
David 31.
In this case, some of the names have been changed.
Missing person report.
On August 4th, 1982, the Ventura County, California Sheriff's Department received a call about a missing woman. When 25-year-old Marcy Davis hadn't been heard from in almost 2 days, her sister became worried. Several hours later, the department received a call about a vehicle stuck and abandoned in a ditch. A check of the plates revealed that it belonged to Marcy Davis. There was no sign of her. She might have walked away to find help and possibly run into worse trouble. Or someone else may have ditched the vehicle. The cold engine made it impossible to determine how long it had been there. A pair of women's jeans found nearby suggested foul play. But the place was used as a dumping ground for all sorts of trash. Because the car provided the first real clue to Marcy Davis's fate, Ventura County sheriffs scoured the scene to see what else they might find. They prepared for the worst. They found it. Assigned to the case was Sergeant Larry Robertson.
The patrol division had decided that they should bring in a search and rescue team to look for the body. In fact, they did find the body. She had been found strangled and left nude, buried under leaves and debris.
Have you called forensics?
Marcy Davis's blouse had been torn and tied tightly around her neck. It appeared she might have been raped. The forensics team photographed any clues they could find in the gloom, but decided to abandon the scene until daylight. A guard was posted to keep it secure. Investigators had plenty of other work to do before sunrise.
Hey, have you seen my cigarettes? Can I take yours?
The victim's sister told police that Marcy had left the house on the night of August 3rd to go to a Tupperware party. She said that afterward she was going to JJ's, her favorite hangout.
Buy you more Tupperware?
Yes.
Hi, how you doing today?
Hi, how are you?
Good. Came by, we wanted to ask you a
Detectives
couple of
talked to the
questions
bartender
about,
at JJ's.
Can you describe the men she was with?
She told them that the victim had come in around 11 the night she disappeared.
Meets with her friends.
She said that Davis was drinking and playing pool with another bar regular named Michael Nottingham. They left with all the other patrons around closing time, 2 a.m. Because Nottingham was the last person the victim had been with, investigators went to see him.
At the time, we feared that perhaps Michael Nottingham was with her, and he also had been a homicide victim. And we just hadn't found his body yet. So number one, we were trying to establish whether or not his well-being could be verified.
They found him safe at home. He agreed to come to the station to talk. They showed him a photograph of Marcy that her sister provided.
That's Teresa.
He recognized the face, but not the name.
She told you her name is Teresa? That's what she said.
He knew her as Teresa.
This is...
She gave him a ride home, came in for about 10 minutes, then left. That's the last he saw of her, he said.
Wait, license is suspended? No, just want to
Nottingham told them that after she drove off around 3 a.m., he walked to his girlfriend's house and crashed outside until her mother left at 9:30. He said that nobody saw him during that time. After Nottingham gave his statement, police went to the house he shared with his sister. They wanted to speak with her to see if she could confirm his alibi. She recognized the face in the picture as a woman Michael came home with the other night. She corroborated his account of the time spent at home, up to a point. She said he introduced the woman as Kelly, and that wasn't the only difference.
She recalled that Michael and Kelly both got into her car and left together. Obviously, this was very different from the statements that Michael had given to us.
The sheriff's department now had a conflicting story and a 6-hour gap in Michael Nottingham's alibi.
Be the right foot sticking up.
Okay.
Suspicion was building. but they had nothing solid.
Point directs a couple of depth. That's where we are. Some cigarettes.
Any forensic clues found in the victim's car would only support Nottingham's account that he'd been in it.
Go up and give us some aerials.
Investigators needed something to prove that Nottingham had been at the crime scene.
Right about here, and the body's up here. Okay. Okay, now what's going on?
Okay, what I found.
By the light of day, investigators returned to the scene to search for any clues to link him there. The lengthy process left no stone or leaf unturned.
While processing the scene, I sat on the ground in the immediate vicinity of the body, and as we were taking leaf and branches off one at a time looking for evidence. I sat on the ground next to the body for, I would say, at least an hour, perhaps an hour and a half.
Yeah, with this we found about 6 feet away from the vehicle, cigarette butts.
Investigators found a tentative clue, a filterless cigarette butt on the ground near the abandoned vehicle matched Nottingham's brand. The clue was weak, but coupled with the conflicting stories, it allowed police to arrest Nottingham on suspicion of rape and murder. All they had to do now was prove it. Nottingham was taken into custody. As a matter of course, for cases of sexual assault, he was stripped and photographed.
Take off your shirt for us.
Investigators looked for scratches, scrapes, or any other evidence to indicate he may have struggled with his victim. They found something else entirely.
What about the,
As many as 100 small and unusual insect bites dotted his ankles and waistline. Nottingham said they were flea bites. Investigators weren't sure of their significance, but they documented the marks just in case. That night, Sergeant Robertson was awakened by itching around his ankles and waist. He recognized the unforgettable symptoms.
I told my wife if I didn't know better, I would say that these bites on me that itched profusely were chigger bites, and they were just exactly like the chigger bites I had experienced in guerrilla warfare training in Kentucky during the Vietnam era.
that these are the sites where they normally attack?
After his physician confirmed his diagnosis, detectives wondered if these little creatures could somehow provide their big break.
I've got it myself. I've got a hole in here.
They needed an expert's advice. They consulted entomologist James Webb, who specializes in parasitic insects. He told them that chiggers are larvae, the newly hatched spawn of a certain group of mites. They're born with a voracious appetite and are adept at procuring their meal.
And they insert their mouth parts into the host's skin, and then with this special blade, there's one on each side, and then they'll actually inject saliva into the wound, and the saliva then dissolves the protein of the skin, and that pool of liquid then is actually sucked into the chigger with a special gut pump. It brings the material into the intestine, into the gut of the chigger.
The saliva triggers the host's immune system, causing a red, itchy bump around the bite, usually within 24 to 48 hours. A survey of the investigators who searched the scene of Marcy Davis's murder revealed that most bore the telltale marks of a chigger attack.
It's not by the individual bite that we recognize the chigger bite. We recognize it more as a pattern, and usually at a place where there's constriction of clothing. Because the chigger, when the chigger moves up the body, it'll stop along the sock line, or the panty line, or the underwear line, or the belt line.
Out of a case with no real clues, a pattern began to emerge. Michael Nottingham's bite marks were carefully photographed again, at life size. It appeared the murder might have had dozens of witnesses after all. Investigators hoped that by catching Chiggers, they could catch Marcy Davis's killer.
I think we can do it before the sun
Suspect
goes in.
Michael Nottingham swore he'd never been to the area where the victim's body was found. Sergeant Larry Robertson believed the chigger bites on Nottingham's body might tell a different story.
But I had never, ever experienced chiggers in all my years of living in Ventura County. Even though I was active in search and rescue and hunting and fishing, I had never heard of chiggers in Ventura County, and never seen them, and had never read about them in Ventura County.
In fact, they were exceedingly rare in this part of California. If investigators could isolate chiggers to the crime scene, they would have undeniable proof that Nottingham had been there. They called on Dr. Webb for help.
The thing we wanted to do at the crime scene was see if there were chigger mites there to substantiate this hypothesis. And we knew that lizards are good indicators of finding chiggers.
Chiggers attach to lizards and feed off them. Traps were laid to catch the lizards for examination. Once they were found to be infested, Webb and his team broke out the chigger traps. A chigger trap is nothing more than a small black plastic plate that's placed where chiggers are likely to gather. The sun heats it up, providing a warm welcome for the pesky larvae. These creatures are hungry, not smart.
This thing is a warm body, much like a living animal. And so the chiggers, if they're in the vicinity, will move towards the plate and crawl around on the plate, looking for a place to attach.
Webb's team set their traps outside the house of Nottingham's girlfriend, where Nottingham claimed he spent the night sleeping. They placed more traps 20 feet away from the murder scene, and others even closer to the spot where the victim had been found. They checked the traps every half hour during daylight for 3 days. The results were clear.
Not too far from the murder scene, where the body was found, we were getting 10s or 20 or more at a time running around in the black plate. I mean, just large numbers. We also noticed them running around in our shoes when we were standing in that same spot and crawling up onto us.
But just 20 feet away from the body, the chigger activity was minimal. And at the girlfriend's house, they found none at all. The proximity of the chiggers to the victim established Nottingham's presence at the crime scene.
I believe from our research, this was the first time that entomology had ever been used in a capital case or murder case to assist investigators in placing the suspect at the scene of the crime.
From what police could piece together, the victim drove Nottingham to the woods. Maybe she wanted to go, maybe he forced her to go there. Once there, they began to fight. It escalated, and Nottingham beat and killed her, finally strangling her with her shirt. Michael Nottingham was convicted of attempted rape and the first-degree murder of Marcy Davis. He was sentenced to life without possibility of parole. Danger can lurk on the outskirts of town, or it may lurk even closer to home. Seattle, Washington, Once a rugged forest land, now it's a world-class city of 500,000. Some people come here to take advantage of new opportunities. Others come here just to take advantage. 28-year-old Molly McClure had grown up in Seattle and had been away a few years.
Trying to play a little sport, stay in shape and stuff
In
like
October
that.
1985, she moved back to be closer to her family. She rented a modest apartment and found a job she loved as a hotel restaurant consultant. In January 1986, she called the police to report an attempted break-in at her apartment. Her upstairs neighbor, Sherwood Knight, told her he'd seen someone trying to jimmy her window while he was out for his morning jog. He scared the intruder off. The tampering on the window was plain to see. The police made out a report. That seemed like the end of it. But the next day, January 17th, police were called once again to McClure's apartment. They arrived there at the request of her boss, who had phoned them when she failed to show up for work and didn't answer her phone. Officers found her door locked and noticed what appeared to be some new damage to the window. Fearing that McClure might be in trouble, the officers slipped inside. They saw no signs of disturbance. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, in the bedroom, they found Molly McClure murdered in her bed.
Headquarters, we got a homicide over here. We need to detect.
Does it seem to be working that way?
Homicide was called in. Detective Hank Gruber was assigned to the case.
The young lady was laying face down on the bed, and she was partly covered with a blanket, but her head was exposed. She had obvious wounds to the back of her head. There was a gag in her mouth with panties, and they were tied with a sock.
The medical examiner was able to tell from the hemorrhages in the victim's eyes that she had been strangled. From the degree to which blood had pooled in her body, the ME could tell she had been dead 4 or 5 hours. While the apartment was processed for fingerprints or any other clues, the medical examiner carefully collected visible fibers and loose hairs from the body. The intensity of the crime scene processing was momentarily broken. Sherwood Knight came by to return a cookbook he'd borrowed.
The neighbor from upstairs?
How you doing? We're just doing a little checking around here. May I have your name?
He was concerned about Molly and stunned to hear that she was dead.
Oh, this is a book I got.
I'll tell you what, I'd like to do some more talking.
The detective sent him on his way and went back to processing the scene. The Washington State Crime Lab would scrutinize the trace evidence they gathered. Detectives hoped that the solution to this case, if it existed at all, lay somewhere in these small bags.
We had no idea who did this. It wasn't like there were any witnesses or anything to go on, and the case was easily recognized as a case that, if it was going to be solved, would have to be done with trace evidence.
Whoever had tried to invade McClure's apartment the night before had evidently returned to finish what he'd started. From the looks of it, Molly McClure's killer came in through the window of the spare bedroom. There, investigators found a footprint on the sill that didn't match the officer's shoes. This was their first clue that was bigger than a hair and it needed to be preserved. After the sill was photographed, technicians collected it.
If you can actually take the item that has the print on it, you have a way better chance of being successful in comparisons than through pictures. The actual item is always better. So we took the windowsill at that time, and we had our samples from around the house.
The print on the windowsill had to wait until investigators could find a shoe to compare it with. While the trace evidence was being analyzed, detectives sought to find rhyme or reason for the crime. The curious thing was why the culprit made 2 attempts to enter the victim's apartment. Detectives thought that McClure might have been a victim of circumstance. The couple that lived in the apartment before her had a history of domestic violence.
Can I help you?
The boyfriend had moved out several months earlier. Police theorized that he might have returned to kill his former girlfriend, not realizing that she too had moved away.
Yes, sir. Okay. Yeah, she's married. She's here. Hey, Christy, you want to come on out?
But when police paid him a visit, they found the couple had reconciled.
Hi.
Though the victim's apartment wasn't ransacked, police noticed her jewelry box was empty. A check of bank records showed that the victim's cash machine card was used at an ATM several blocks away around the time of her death. So in addition to murder and rape, the killer had come there to rob. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that the rapist's blood was type O, but so was the victim's. No more detailed analysis could be performed on the samples. The medical examiner sent the trace evidence from the sheets to the state crime lab, where it was analyzed by supervising forensic scientist Chesterine Swicklick, now with Swicklick and Associates. She can tell a great deal from small fibers.
Everybody has a characteristic set of debris on them. Everybody has just particles and fibers which may be found on nobody else in the world. We shed our hairs. We go to work and pick up fibers from the seat that we're sitting on, and we may pick up, if the person who worked there with us has a dog and deposits dog hairs on that seat, we pick up some of those dog hairs, and it then becomes part of our set of debris.
Every time we're in contact with someone, we swap some of our debris. At a crime scene, it's up to forensics to determine whose is whose. Swicklick identified a piece of lint from clothing, blue synthetic fibers, a flake of tobacco removed from under the victim's fingernail, some cat hair, and 18 fragments of dark human hair. She determined that characteristics of the hair suggested it was from an African American. It was definitely not that of blonde, blue-eyed Molly McClure. Detectives returned to the scene to collect more clues. The debris didn't seem like the victim's, as she was also a non-smoker who was allergic to cats. But if the killer had left these traces, they would be concentrated around the victim and not elsewhere in the apartment. They collected samples of the debris from the floor of each room, moving to the corners where it tends to gather. They found no cat fur, no tobacco, no African American hairs. A picture of the killer was emerging out of the dust. He could have been an anonymous intruder or someone closer to home. In a murder investigation, it's easier to eliminate familiar faces before looking for new suspects. Sherwood Knight, who had frightened off the burglar at the victim's window, had been helpful in the investigation, but detectives ran a check on him anyway. Gruber's partner, Detective Rudy Sutlovich, discovered that Knight had a record.
And he had a history of robberies and burglaries and other assaults.
and he had been released from prison approximately 3 months prior to this.
Thank you very much. Officer Smith here with me.
Detectives paid a visit to Sherwood Knight and his girlfriend. The couple lived in the apartment above the victims. Knight's girlfriend told detectives that they had had a fight the night McClure was murdered.
And so then you came back, noticed
Sherwood slept on the couch. She told police that she woke around 5:30 a.m.
I don't think so.
Knight was already out for his morning jog. He came home a short time later wearing his jogging clothes like he always did. Then he rushed off for his class at North Seattle Community College.
He was enrolled there, but nobody could ever remember seeing him. Didn't go to his classes or anything, but he had been telling his girlfriend that he was going to school during the daytime.
Based on his past record, investigators thought Knight might be guilty of more than playing hooky.
I got it.
Detective Sepulveda, I have a search warrant.
A search
Please step
warrant?
aside, please. Yes, we have some work we need to do here.
On January 21st, 4 days after the murder, detectives served a search warrant on Knight's apartment.
Questions at this point.
They were authorized to gather trace evidence collected from the corners of the apartment. Fiber samples from blankets, cat hair, the clothing Knight was said to have worn the night of the murder, and even the clothing he wore when they served the warrant.
Well, I'll look at my attorney.
As it turned out, he was wearing the sweatshirt he usually jogged in.
Shirt, pants, shoes too, please. Guys, let's
Detectives found the jogging pants soaking in a bucket of water.
Yep.
They collected the pants, bucket and all.
Thanks.
Knight was read his rights and taken into custody. There, his hair, blood, and saliva samples were collected. Authorities could hold him no longer than 48 hours unless the tests turned up evidence to directly link him to the crime.
Hold still.
The shoe print left on the victim's windowsill matched the tread on running shoes taken from the suspect. But the sneaker was common, and the print would match thousands of others all over Seattle. Testing the trace evidence was more time-consuming. The pants had to be dried before they were looked at. The fibers had to be scrutinized one by one. Even matching hairs is tricky because two hairs taken from the same person might not necessarily match.
If you just look at your own hair, the hair of someone who's sitting next to you, you could see some hairs are thicker, some are thinner, some are darker, some are lighter, some are coarser, some are finer.
The 48 hours came and went without a definitive result. Knight had to be released. But little by little, the trace evidence began to tell the bigger story. The distinctive shape and pattern of some hairs revealed that they were from a cat. Their length and color matched Knight's pet. Then, Swicklick analyzed Sherwood Knight's pants. Red cotton fibers and cat hair were entangled in pills of lint found clinging to them. The pills matched the lint found on the victim. She still wasn't satisfied.
Even though it's very compelling evidence, I would have to say there is a possibility it could have come from another pair of pants with red cotton and with cat hairs. Cats are not a rare species. The red cotton is not unusual.
As her testing continued, more fibers on the victim matched other items taken from Knight's apartment. His hairs, too, matched those from the crime scene. As incriminating as that evidence seemed to be, investigators feared that no jury would buy a case that was solved by lint and cat hair. They sought an array of evidence since no single irrefutable piece had been found. But they were getting closer. They discovered telltale bloodstains around the waistband of Knight's sweatshirt. the droplets had apparently escaped Knight's notice. Technicians tested them against the suspect's and victim's own blood. Though tests weren't as precise in the 1980s as they are today, the blood was found to be consistent with the victim's, a Caucasian with type O. Now, investigators had blood as well as hair and fibers to implicate the suspect.
All these little circumstances would not be sufficient to charge somebody with a murder or any crime. But accumulating each one of these little circumstances, they all add up so long as they're all consistent with the same conclusion, which is that Sherwood Knight was in Molly's apartment that morning and that he's the one who committed the murder.
Investigators were ready to bring him in. The only problem was where to find him. When Seattle police went to arrest Sherwood Knight for the murder of Molly McClure, they learned he'd fled. A manhunt eventually led to an informant who told police of his whereabouts.
How about you, partner? Change the car.
On April 23rd, Sherwood Knight was arrested.
What?
Based on the evidence and interviews with Knight's acquaintances, a picture of the victim's last hours came into focus. Sherwood Knight had faked the first break-in so that he could scope out the victim's apartment while winning her trust. The next night, he broke in, attacked, and killed her, but not before forcing her to reveal her cash machine password. For his crimes, Sherwood Knight received life without parole. The McClure case was solved on the combined weight of tiny fibers, a drop of blood, and a few strands of cat hair. In a hotel in Ohio, investigators had even less to link a killer to the crime scene. Blue Ash, Ohio is a quiet town just outside of Cincinnati. People here guard their privacy. In this story, the names of the victim and her family have been changed. On September 3rd, 1994, Bert Stein and June Mays had come to Blue Ash for a family reunion. They'd left their sister, Rose Levy, in the room while they went to breakfast. Rose had promised to join them, but hadn't made it.
Oh! Oh my goodness, Rose.
I don't know.
Rose, is she breathing?
A joyful occasion turned into a family tragedy when they discovered 68-year-old Rose collapsed on the floor of their suite. They had been gone only 30 minutes.
Rose?
Hello, desk.
Rose?
She clung to life,
This is
but
room
just
220.
barely.
Yeah, there's somebody down. Please send somebody.
From the looks of it, she had suffered a heart attack or a stroke.
Move back. Everybody please move back.
Medical technicians raced to save her. Police arrived too as part of their normal procedure. Rose Levy died in the hospital. It wasn't a heart attack or stroke that killed her. She had been beaten to death. By the time the victim reached the hospital, bruises and welts had begun to form. Among them were heel marks on her chest and a strange rectangular mark evidently caused by the murder weapon. The medical examiner couldn't discern what it was. Further examination revealed that 2 of the victim's teeth had been knocked out and several bones in her face had been fractured. The damage she received was equal to what a body endures when it hits a brick wall at 40 miles per hour. This was the unforgettable face of a homicide. Blue Ash, Ohio police launched an investigation. The room was cordoned off and scoured for clues. Determining the useful clues wasn't easy. Assigned to the case were detectives Jim Schaefer and Larry Stokes.
The crime scene was extremely contaminated by the time investigators got there, but it was only because of the attempts to resuscitate her.
Detective Jim Schaefer.
Besides blood, there was a footprint that was discovered in the bathroom, and a lot of other items that were later found to be items left by rescue workers.
Rose, you awake? Are you there?
According to June Mays and Bert Stein, Rose was still dressing when they were ready to go to breakfast.
Oh, yes. Yeah,
She told the couple to go ahead without her.
All right, don't forget
She'd be down in a minute to join them.
Okay. Okay? All right. No, she's going to take a shower.
She never made it. As the investigation continued, some items were discovered missing. Mays, who left her purse in the room while she was at breakfast, noticed that $500 was taken from it.
Thank you, ma'am. And where did you leave that purse?
Later, the victim's family realized that when Rose was rushed to the hospital, she wasn't wearing a favorite ring and the custom-made pendant she never removed. They didn't turn up in a search of the room. Investigators recovered one of the victim's teeth from the carpet, but could find nothing to link a suspect to the robbery homicide. Stokes and Schaefer had their work cut out for them. Every guest and every employee was a potential witness or a potential suspect. According to Schaefer, everyone had to be questioned.
With the chart of the over 100 hotel employees and over 300 guests, we started in on establishing alibis or whereabouts for each of those individuals.
As detectives began the chore of sending surveys to guests in order to locate potential witnesses, they narrowed the field of potential suspects. The killer could only have struck during the 30 minutes that Bert and June were at breakfast. The door to the room locked automatically, so a person would have to have been let in or would have needed a key to gain entry. Detectives focused on hotel employees who worked that shift and had access to pass keys. They asked each employee to account for his whereabouts during that half hour and to name someone who could vouch for him.
The main object of this investigation at that point became, let's find out who can alibi for who during this time period, and the one person that will not have an alibi will be someone definitely worth looking at.
Investigators knew that it took a sick man to commit a crime this brutal. They were closer to the truth than they ever imagined. Detectives Schaefer and Stokes began to make progress on the Rose Levy homicide investigation as they culled the list of hotel employees. One employee made mention of Elwood Jones, a co-worker who had called in sick with a hand injury. Jones had filed for workers' compensation, saying he'd cut his hand on a metal stairwell on the job. Detectives called him in for an interview. He was one of the only employees who had no alibi during that fatal half hour. They wanted to know more about his injury. They went to Bethesda Oak Hospital, bringing along a court order giving them access to Elwood Jones's records. Jones had checked into the emergency room of the hospital 3 days after the murder with a serious hand injury. The small cut above the knuckle of his left index finger had already sealed up, but an infection festered within.
Oh, well, what's this?
Jones's hand was severely swollen and intensely painful.
Say you did.
He was running a fever.
You did.
Hand surgeon John McDonough was called in to examine the wound.
This was a tremendous blow that he had taken to his hand because it tore the capsule of the joint and inoculated the bacteria directly into the finger joint. It would take a significant amount of pressure to have that occur.
When McDonough asked Jones what happened, he said he'd cut it on a dumpster at work. Not only did that seem unlikely, it also contradicted what he'd told the staff earlier. Jones was left-handed. To McDonough, the position of the wound above the knuckle of the dominant hand indicated that the patient probably was wounded as he punched someone in the mouth. In fact, the injury was so characteristic of a so-called fight bite that McDonough had it photographed to use in his classes. If that were really the cause, McDonough wasn't surprised that his patient lied about it.
People that have human bite injuries try to hide them, try to make light of them, tell you they did something else, like brushing their hand against the wall or cutting it on a dumpster.
The wound, whatever had caused it, called for immediate surgery. McDonough opened and drained it. He reserved some of the fluid so that the infectious bacteria could be cultured and studied. Once it was identified, the proper antibiotic could be prescribed. A human mouth, even a clean one, is home to 42 species of bacteria. Someone with poor dental hygiene can have more. A human bite can be akin to being cut with an object from the bottom of a sewer. At the hospital microbiology lab, the bacteria from Elwood Jones's wound was incubated until the sample grew large enough to be recognizable.
This happens to be a contaminant.
Culturing bacteria can happen overnight or take more than a week. Larry Gray is the director of the lab.
The technologist on the workup bench will look at the plates. They will look at the organisms, the texture, how large they are, the colonies, the size, the color.
The result is then stained, revealing more characteristics of the species when examined under a microscope. Finally, the bacterium is identified and antibiotics are administered.
Jones, how are you feeling
Jones
today?
stayed in the hospital while his infection was being treated.
How's the hand?
After 5 days, he went home.
Okay, I'll get a copy of this and put it in his record.
The doctor told the detectives that Jones's hand was infected with Eikenella corrodens. It's a somewhat rare bacterium that thrives on dental plaque below the gum line. To find it inside a man's knuckle required some explaining. McDonough explained it.
When the hand strikes a tooth, the tooth may be broken or the sharp edge inoculates bacteria, and in this case Eikenella corrodens, deep inside the tissue. I've been doing hand surgery for almost 25 years and I've only seen 3 cases of Eikenella infection. All 3 of those were associated with a human bite injury.
Detectives felt that Jones could have contracted Eikenella from striking Rose Levy. Now they had what they needed to isolate Jones as the prime suspect. But Jones offered an explanation. He said that after he cut himself on the dumpster, he sucked the wound to clean it. Less than 3/10 of the population has Eikenella bacteria in its saliva, but authorities had to be sure. They swabbed the inside of Jones's mouth and sent the swabs to the lab to be cultured. The results came back. They were negative. The infection was consistent with injuries incurred during the beating death of Rose Levy, and the rarity of the Eikenella infection was enough for detectives to serve a search warrant on the apartment Jones shared with his girlfriend. They confiscated his shoes so they could compare their heel marks with bruises found on the victim. Jones's car was impounded and searched for fiber, blood, or other trace evidence to tie him to the crime. But the most compelling evidence was visible to the naked eye, a hotel passkey. and in a toolbox in the trunk lay the victim's missing pendant. Jones was arrested for the murder of Rose Levy. Prior to his trial, the bruising patterns on the victim were digitally enhanced and the murder weapon was revealed. The marks corresponded with the walkie-talkie that Jones carried on the job. His shoes also matched bruises found on the body. Based on the evidence, investigators put together the events in the hotel room. When Jones saw Bert Stein and June Mays leave for breakfast, he thought the coast was clear for robbery. The suite they shared usually had only 2 occupants. Jones had no reason to believe that September 2nd was any different. He used his passkey to enter. He didn't expect a witness.
Excuse me.
He knew he couldn't afford one. The murder accusation came from the victim's own mouth. On December 11th, 1996, Elwood Jones was convicted of aggravated burglary, aggravated robbery, and aggravated murder. Because of the violent nature of the crime, he was sentenced to death. The perfect murder has no witnesses. The perfect killer leaves no trail. But the sheer act of murder disrupts the natural order of things and always leaves traces behind. Science is learning how to read those traces, no matter how insignificant they may first appear to be. In Texas, a raging fire turns a couple's home into a death chamber. Investigators believe it's arson, but they'll need an expert to sniff out the truth. After a student in Illinois disappears, police fear that she's the victim of a murder. The crime scene may have gone cold, but at least one tracker is still hot on the trail. Detectives in Tennessee suspect that a missing persons case has turned into a homicide. To make their case, they must rely on canine detectives to dig up the truth. When plotting a murder, a clever killer will do anything to cover his tracks. But not all clues can be concealed. When investigators lose sight of their prey, it falls upon a special breed of dog to pick up the scent of the kill. On June 8, 1994, around 3:15 a.m., a pizza delivery man in the rural community of Belleville, Texas, was on his way home after working the late shift. He spotted a man pulling out of the driveway of a burning house. The driver flagged down the delivery man. He identified himself as Charles Fitz. Fitz said his wife was trapped inside their burning home. He begged the delivery driver to call 911. By the time the fire department arrived, intense flames and heat consumed the home. As long as the fire burned out of control, firefighters could only battle the blaze from the outside. Inside, chances for Francis Fitz's survival vanished with the rest of the couple's home. Emergency medical technicians arrived to treat Charles Fitz. Disoriented and upset, he blamed the fire on the cheap wiring that ran through their home. With difficulty breathing, Fitz was transported to the hospital for treatment of smoke inhalation. By the time the flames were extinguished, some 3 hours later, the house was reduced to a smoldering pile of rubble. Somewhere inside was the body of Francis Fitz. Detectives began their routine investigation into the cause and origin of the deadly fire. They started with a visit to Charles Fitz, who was recovering in the hospital. Fitz told them that he'd fallen asleep that night on the sofa. In the early morning hours, he woke up to a house filled with smoke. He tried to get to the bedroom to save Frances, his wife of 17 years. But the smoke and flames were too intense. He'd tried repeatedly to get back into the house, breaking several windows in the process. But all of his rescue attempts failed. It was a harrowing account. But to investigators at the Austin County Sheriff's Department, the story was at odds with Fitz's physical condition. Sheriff's Deputy Richard Holloman explains.
According to what he was telling us, there should have been, some burn marks on his arms, his face, and should have singed hair, but of which he had none.
The next morning, investigators proceeded to the fire scene. Frances Fitz was found in what used to be the couple's bedroom. Her charred remains were transported to the morgue. The medical examiner would later confirm that the cause of death was smoke inhalation. Investigators began processing the burned-out wreckage. Looking to confirm Fitz's story, they searched for signs of faulty wiring. But there was no evidence of an electrical source to the fire. Neither the gas main nor the water heater had malfunctioned. With the obvious accidental causes ruled out, there remained one possibility. The fire had been intentionally set. Investigators began looking for signs of arson. During their search, investigators found debris with alligator-like patterns on the surface. Wood rarely burns this way unless it is doused with an accelerant, like gasoline or lighter fluid. Finding traces of the fluid would be the first step in proving arson. It appeared, however, that the fire had burned away that evidence. But investigators had another tool in their arsenal. Canines can be trained to sniff out traces of arson that otherwise go undetected by humans. George Cavett of the Houston Police Department teaches dogs to search for flammable liquids called hydrocarbons.
It can be naphtha, alcohol, distilled liquor, brake fluid, anything of that nature. Coleman fuel, charcoal lighter fluid, just a large list of things that puts off the same scent that the dogs can detect.
Okay, good girl, we got that. Good girl, let's check.
The dogs began searching through the remains of Fitz's house.
Back here, fetch it up for me.
Hours of searching passed with no signs of a hit. But then they found something. And the location was just inches from where Francis Fitz's body was discovered.
Good girl.
and he worked all areas of the bedroom and came back right to the flooring that the victim was laying on top of and gave me an alert, and right beside of it and on the bed springs and that whole segment.
The samples were placed in sealed cans to preserve whatever vapors remained and sent to the lab. With their suspicions raised, investigators next took the dogs to the police impound lot, where Charles Fitz's truck had been towed. The dogs were given the command to search for traces of accelerant. Again, the dogs alerted police to the presence of hydrocarbons on the gas and brake pedals. They were collected along with the other samples and sent to the lab for analysis. With the help of their canine detectives, investigators had recovered enough evidence for forensic examiners to conduct a thorough analysis.
All right, good girl.
At the lab, a piece of charcoal is inserted into each paint can containing the evidence removed from the scene. Then, the can is heated to just below the boiling point for up to 18 hours. During that time, the charcoal absorbs any hydrocarbon vapors. Any potential hydrocarbon is then removed from the charcoal with the solvent carbon disulfide. The resulting liquid is then analyzed by means of a gas chromatograph. By breaking down the substance into its various components, the gas chromatograph produces a pattern of peaks and valleys. In this case, the known pattern for gasoline came up in 3 of the 13 samples. The 2 from the interior of Charles Fitz's truck and 1 from the bedroom where the body was found. Thanks to the accelerant-sniffing dogs, the deadly blaze had been exposed as a deliberate act of arson and a homicide. And Charles Fitz, the only other person in the house, was the most likely suspect in his wife's death. Police in Belleville, Texas, investigating the death of Francis Fitz, killed in a house fire, believed they had uncovered a murder. Since he was the only other person in the house, Francis's husband Charles was the prime suspect. Travis Kane, the district attorney of Austin County, began delving into Charles Fitz's background.
The family of Francis Fitz told us that Charles Fitz was a braggart person who really never held a job. He was somebody who wore flashy jewelry, somebody who wore big hats and big boots, who bragged a lot and made a lot of noise about what he was going to do, but never really did anything.
Through family members, police learned that Frances, a secretary, was the breadwinner of the family, even though she struggled with debilitating arthritis.
I thought I'd just fix us some spaghetti.
She was dedicated to taking care of Charles and never spoke poorly of him. Though Charles rarely gave anything of himself in return, the marriage seemed solid to outside observers. Having found no obvious marital problems, police struggled to find a motive for the deadly fire. Perhaps in one of Charles's many unsuccessful business ventures, he had made enemies. Someone seeking revenge against him could have set the fire. Detectives decided to take a closer look at some of his former associates. As investigators continued looking for answers, Francis's relatives sifted through the wreckage, looking for any mementos of their lost loved one. During their search, they found some documents that had survived the fire. Among the papers found was a list of overseas phone numbers and several insurance policies on Francis, listing Charles as the beneficiary. Investigators immediately contacted the insurance agent. They learned that Charles Fitz had recently made changes to the policies. In the months before the fire, he had upped the amount of the insurance on Francis's life and on the home. The agent told investigators that Charles Fitz stood to gain $824,000 from the deadly fire. Though the timing of the policy changes was suspicious, it wasn't proof of murder. And investigators still had to rule out the possibility that someone other than Charles Fitz had committed the crime. But all of Charles's past business associates had been dismissed as potential suspects. Now, investigators had to determine why Charles Fitz would want his dedicated and supportive wife dead. For answers, they turned to the only other piece of evidence that survived the fire. One of the overseas phone numbers led investigators to a young Englishwoman named Tracy Munns, who was living in the Philippines. Tracy reluctantly told investigators that she had had an affair with Charles Fitz while she attended college in Texas. She claimed that they planned to marry after she graduated. Charles had agreed to leave his wife. But Tracy grew frustrated when Charles didn't keep up his end of the bargain. She moved to the Philippines and tried to cut ties. Charles wouldn't let it go.
Then in June of '94, he called her and said, "My wife is gone. I'm free to come down to you." And she said, "No, I don't want to have anything to do with you." And that was the last time she spoke to Charles Fitz.
By killing his wife, investigators believed that Charles Fitz was clearing the way to be with his mistress. The insurance payoff would give him enough money to start a new life overseas. Though Tracy Munns had provided investigators with a possible motive, they needed to find proof that Fitz had planned his wife's murder. Poring over the suspect's financial records, investigators learned that Charles Fitz had sold his second car, a Mercedes, shortly after the fire. Though it didn't seem like much of a clue, they tracked down the classified ad and the man who bought the car. To investigators, the language of the ad was telling. It read, "1983 Mercedes, must sell, leaving country." The man who bought the car said that during the sale, Fitz told him that he was unmarried. The ad and the information from the car buyer, in addition to the arson uncovered by the accelerant sniffing dogs, was enough for investigators to arrest Charles Fitz for murder. Detectives theorized that Charles Fitz believed he had everything to gain from torching his house and killing his wife. Not only would it give him a huge amount of money, it would clear the way for him to be with his young lover. But he would be disappointed. 1 week after the fire, Fitz proposed to Tracy, only to find that she'd already married someone else. On February 2nd, 1996, Charles Fitz was found guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. By picking up the scent of arson, dogs in Texas brought a killer to justice. But in the Midwest, police couldn't prove a murder had been committed until they got some help finding the victim. On March 5th, 1987, a distraught father contacted the Champaign, Illinois Police Department.
When was the last time you saw him?
Ludwig Warner believed his 22-year-old daughter Karen was missing. It was a Thursday, and he hadn't seen her or her car since Monday morning. Her purse, wallet, and eyeglasses were also gone. His daughter frequently spent the night at friends' homes, but she'd never been gone for this long without checking in. The next day, detectives questioned Karen Warner's friends. Like the young woman's father, none of them had seen her in 4 days. One close friend told investigators that over the last week she hadn't noticed anything unusual about Karen's behavior. Though Karen had recently lost her job, she was looking forward to resuming her college career in the fall. Karen hadn't mentioned any plans to travel. But that didn't mean that she hadn't taken an unexpected trip. In fact, Karen had recently been getting calls from an ex-boyfriend named Curly B. Lee. He wanted to rekindle the romance, but Karen was planning to tell him in person that she wasn't interested. Curly had become too possessive and physically abusive. But it was possible that Karen had a change of heart. During their time as a couple, Karen and Curly frequently took unplanned vacations. Investigators at the Champaign Police Department believed there was a reasonable explanation for Karen's disappearance. Sergeant Jim Luking explains.
She was gone, he was gone, and her car was gone. It could very well have been that they decided to go off together, which wouldn't be all that unusual for two people to decide to do that.
To find out, investigators paid a visit to Curly Lee. When they were led into his rooming house, they found that Curly and his clothes were gone. And nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But Karen's family didn't buy it. Desperate for answers, they urged the media to get involved. Hoping to generate a lead, pictures of Karen, her car, and of Curly were published in the area newspapers, along with details of her disappearance. No one responded about Karen, but someone had seen Curly. The caller reported that a friend of hers had driven Curly to the bus station 2 days after Karen's disappearance. Curly said he was heading south to his mother's house in Hughes, Arkansas. Champaign police contacted law enforcement in Arkansas and asked them to speak with Curly. Like the rest of Karen's friends, Curly said that he had no idea where his ex-girlfriend could be. He said they had spoken briefly before he left Champaign, but that was just to say goodbye. As investigators struggled to find answers, the family's publicity campaign paid off. A man in Danville, Illinois, 30 miles from Champaign, recognized the photograph of Karen's car. He believed that same car was sitting abandoned in his church parking lot. A check of the license plates confirmed that it was the vehicle registered to the missing woman. If any questions remained about Karen Warner's fate, the discovery of her abandoned car erased them.
That was the first physical evidence that there was something wrong. It would be unusual for her to be there, for her car to be there especially.
Investigators brought the car to the police station for a more detailed forensic examination. But the initial search of the vehicle indicated no obvious signs of a struggle. The car was thoroughly dusted for prints. Technicians collected blue and red fibers found on the floor mats and in the trunk. The items were forwarded to the crime lab for further analysis. Hoping someone had seen how the car ended up in Danville, police turned again to the public for help. And again, the strategy paid off. A woman called police to tell them that she may have seen the car. Police brought her in to identify the vehicle.
I was driving.
The woman's name was Rhonda, and like Karen, she too was an ex-girlfriend of Curly Lee's. She recognized the car immediately. Police questioned her further. Rhonda admitted that she had driven the car around the time Karen had been reported missing. But she had no idea that the car belonged to Karen Warner. She told investigators that Curly had called her one night asking for a favor.
He said he was going to return the car to a friend.
He needed to return a car to a friend in Danville and asked her to drive him because he didn't have a license.
You know what was in the bag? Did he get it in?
To Detective Mike Smith, Curly's demeanor sounded suspicious.
What we're trying to do, and a plate is missing. She asked him whose car it was, and he never replied. He never answered. And he told her to avoid certain streets and to drive fast.
Rhonda said that Curly then dropped her off at a bar in Danville. She remembered that he had a grocery bag with him in the car, but she never saw what it contained. Curly explained that he had a few errands to run and told her to wait for him in the bar. He gave Rhonda some money for a drink, then drove away. About 15 minutes later, Curly returned to the bar on foot.
He said that he didn't have a valid
Later
driver's
that night,
license.
he had some friends drive them back to Champaign. Rhonda hadn't heard from Curly since. Investigators suspected that in the 15 minutes that Curly had left Rhonda alone, he would have had time to dispose of Karen's body, which was likely hidden in the trunk. They believed he then abandoned the car in the church parking lot, located just a few blocks away, and then returned to the bar on foot. They now focused their attention to finding Karen Warner's body, and they believed it was in the wooded area behind the bar.
He was only gone long enough that he couldn't have gone very far to place the body anywhere else, so it had to be down there. In our opinion, it had to be down there in the weeds or in the brush or in the river.
But finding a body in this densely wooded area would be difficult. There were no obvious grave sites. And in the cold air, any smell of decomposition had been hampered. After 2 days of searching, the team had reached their limits. But investigators had one more option. They called upon the expertise of Joyce Fairs, a dog handler from nearby Urbana, Illinois. For over 15 years, Fairs and her dogs have volunteered their services to local police and sheriff's departments. Bloodhounds like hers are bred to distinguish the vaguest of scents. The handler has to begin with a scent article. It can be any object the victim has come in contact with. In this case, investigators got a t-shirt and a pillowcase from Karen Warner's bedroom and sealed them in a plastic bag to preserve the scent. Fairs then gave the dog the find command, letting him know his job is to find the source of that same smell.
Check it out.
The bloodhound took Fairs on a twisted route. 3 times, he brought her down close to the river, as if someone had carried Karen's body, looking for a place to hide her, then deciding against it. Then the dog led Fares to a deep ravine. But it would have been difficult for anyone to cross this gorge carrying a body. Investigators knew that the body had to be near. Within 15 minutes, the dog closed in on an area of brush. At first, Joyce thought he'd lost the scent, but then, in a slight depression covered with brush, she caught a glimpse of a red sweater and a human hand. Investigators in Champaign, Illinois struggled to solve the disappearance of 22-year-old Karen Warner. Hidden in a remote wooded area, Joyce Fares and her bloodhound believed they had finally found her.
And then I could see her hand, the back of her right hand. And that's when I shouted for Jim Looking to come. I believed that we'd found her body.
After removing the body, investigators began scouring the area for clues. Nearby, investigators recovered a blue blanket. 100 yards from where the body was found, they discovered a grocery bag like the one Rhonda described. Inside, investigators found shoes, eyeglasses, and a purse. All of the items were collected and sent on to the crime lab.
Okay, hold those for me. Just
Joyce Fares and her dog had uncovered a homicide, and investigators had little doubt that they had found Karen Warner. Using dental records, the medical examiner confirmed that the remains were those of Karen Warner. And a fracture to one of the bones in her throat told him that the young woman had been strangled to death. The lack of defensive wounds and other injuries suggested that Karen had been caught off guard. Now, investigators had to make a murder case. And Karen's ex-boyfriend, Curly B. Lee, was their prime suspect. They turned to the crime lab for help. Examiners confirmed that blue fibers recovered from the victim's clothes matched the fibers from the blue blanket found near the body. Next, the blue fibers from the crime scene and red fibers taken from Karen's sweater were compared against the blue and red fibers found in the trunk of Karen's car. All of the fibers matched. Examiners had proven that Karen Warner had been wrapped in a blanket and then placed in the trunk of her car. And the last person known to have driven the vehicle was Curly B. Lee. Illinois police now had enough evidence to arrest him for murder. But as they headed south to Arkansas to pick him up, they learned from authorities that Curly had fled again. But this time, police quickly tracked him down. By canvassing bus stations, Arkansas police learned that Curly had just purchased a ticket to Palm Beach, Florida. Investigators contacted law enforcement in Palm Beach. They staked out the bus station, waiting for the unsuspecting fugitive to arrive. Curly was arrested and extradited to Illinois. Back in Champaign, investigators confronted Curly with the case they'd built against him. He admitted killing Karen, but claimed it was an accident. All of the evidence suggested otherwise. Police theorized that Curly had tried to rekindle his romance with Karen. But when Karen refused his advances, he erupted into a rage.
He didn't like to lose anything, and he decided that he was going to teach her a lesson. Now, whether he intended to kill her or accidentally killed her, I don't know, but I think if you strangle somebody, you intend to kill them.
After killing her, Curley struggled to come up with a plan to cover up his crime. He collected Karen's belongings in a grocery bag and then searched for a blanket to wrap the body in before carrying her out to the trunk. Later that night, after dropping Rhonda off at the bar, he drove behind the property and searched for a place to get rid of his victim. In an effort to make it appear that Karen had simply taken off, he drove her car to a nearby church and abandoned it. 2 days later, he packed up his belongings and fled to Arkansas. But with Joyce Fares and her bloodhound on his trail, Curley's run quickly came to an end. Curley B. Lee was convicted of murder and concealment of a homicide. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison. In the Karen Warner case, the dog had to follow a trail that was 7 days old. To solve a murder in Tennessee, another canine will have to track a scent buried for almost a year. In June of 1996, Ray and Fleeta Holliday went to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation for help in finding their 39-year-old daughter, Kathy Beadle.
So tell me what you found out.
In April, they said, they received a letter from her saying that she discovered she had cancer and was headed to a clinic in Toronto for experimental treatment.
Faxes.
She said that she didn't want any direct contact with them during the therapy. From then on, Kathy communicated only by fax. The typed messages were brief and impersonal, completely out of character for their daughter. Fearing that Kathy might be going through some kind of emotional breakdown, Ray went to Toronto to find his daughter. He got the address off a Father's Day card Kathy had sent the month before. As he approached the front of the treatment center, a panic set in. The address belonged to a run-down and abandoned building. There was no cancer treatment center and no clue to his daughter's whereabouts. Fleeta Holliday added that just before her daughter disappeared, Kathy was considering leaving her husband, Tony Vick. But Kathy had 2 children from a previous marriage to think about. Her first husband had died tragically in a plane crash. As part of the insurance settlement, Kathy received $8,000 a month. Though she had become wealthy as a result, she wanted her kids to have a father figure. But Kathy seemed to have fallen out of love with Tony. And though he made every attempt to get back in her good graces, Kathy didn't want to talk to him. She told her mother that she might need some time to herself in the near future to sort things out. With no evidence suggesting a crime had taken place, investigators at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation believed that Kathy had simply kept her word. But Kathy's parents knew their daughter would not leave her 2 kids behind and disappear without a trace. Desperate for answers, they mounted their own publicity campaign, plastering Kathy's picture all over Tennessee. But the family never heard a word. In February of 1997, nearly a year since Kathy had disappeared, Ray and Fleeta Holliday made one last attempt to get the police involved. They contacted the Knox County Sheriff's Office. They told investigators that a few months back, Kathy's husband, Tony Vick, had also disappeared, claiming he was going to find his wife. He left the children and the couple's home with the Hollidays. They hadn't heard from Tony since. The resulting financial strain forced Ray and Fleeta to sell their daughter's home. But before they did, they wanted to be absolutely sure that there weren't any overlooked clues in the home. Sheriff Tim Hutchinson took the case.
Once we learned that all the events that had occurred prior to us being notified that, number one, she was missing from our jurisdiction, and second, it had been a long period of time. That's hard to follow up and start an investigation when that much time has lapsed.
Investigators processed the empty home, searching for any clues that could help them determine Kathy Beadle's fate. But since the home had been placed on the market, a vast amount of potential evidence had been destroyed. Furniture and belongings had been removed. Floors had been scrubbed. Walls had been painted. For investigator Terry Lee of the Knox County Sheriff's Office, working a cleaned crime scene means looking past the obvious.
For instance, in this situation, the carpet had been vacuumed. That's taken up good forensic evidence such as hair, fiber samples, and so forth that we would normally collect. So you have to look a little bit deeper.
Investigators scrutinized every inch of the home. They processed all of the sink drains in the home using luminol, a chemical that glows in the presence of blood. Traces of blood were found in 3 separate sink traps. The traps were removed and sent to the crime lab. Investigators determined that the blood found in the sink was human. But the samples were too deteriorated for a more comprehensive analysis. Still, the presence of so much blood led detectives to suspect something violent had happened in the couple's home. Investigators in Tennessee struggled to solve the mysterious disappearance of Kathy Beadle, a 39-year-old mother of 2, missing for over a year. After searching her and her husband's vacant home, investigators believed they had uncovered evidence of foul play. They decided to take a closer look at Kathy's husband, Tony Vick. What they found was not encouraging.
And then we learned that Tony Vick's first wife died suspiciously. Some say she slipped and fell and drowned in a bathtub.
Others said that Tony had murdered her. But instead of being charged, Vick turned a profit, earning life insurance payoffs that totaled over $600,000. Investigators now feared that Kathy Beadle met a similar fate. And they believed money was the motive for murder. But investigators were a long way from making their case. They had no body, and their prime suspect, Tony Vick, had also disappeared. Hoping to generate a lead, details of the case were published in area newspapers. The tactic worked. The owner of a local consignment shop called police. She recognized Tony Vick.
It belonged to my wife. She just
The woman stated that a few months back, a man dropped off a lot of expensive clothing. He seemed glum and told her that his girlfriend had just died of cancer. He told the owner that he would return for the check once the clothes had been sold. He never did.
I'm having a tough time with this. Do you think I
The
can
check,
get that?
made out to Tony Vick, remained unclaimed.
Do the best I can and have a
For investigators, Tony's statements to the consignment store owner had a very clear meaning.
That tells us that, you know, she's definitely deceased. We just need to keep digging, need to keep looking until we can find her body.
To build their case against Tony Vick, Knox County sheriffs needed to know his every move prior to his disappearance. Investigators tracked down the nanny who took care of his and Kathy's children. She hadn't observed any violence between Kathy and Tony, nor did she notice any sign of struggle in the home following Kathy's disappearance. But she was able to offer investigators an unusual piece of information. She remembered that after Kathy disappeared, Vic scolded her and the kids for playing in the backyard. Investigators suspected that there was another reason for his outburst. They now believed that Kathy Beadle was buried somewhere in her own backyard. A team of forensic investigators went back to Tony and Kathy's vacant house. Now they were looking for a clandestine grave, one that had been dug a year earlier. But after hours of searching, they could find no evidence of a burial site. Unless investigators could find Kathy's body, making a murder case against Tony Vick would be difficult. And they were running out of ways to accomplish that goal. In Tennessee, investigators from the Knox County Sheriff's Department believed their missing person, Kathy Beadle, had been murdered. And they believed her body had been buried somewhere in her backyard. But hours of exhaustive searching yielded no clues. Investigators had one more option. At Knox County's Canine unit, dogs are trained to search for a variety of scents, from narcotics to explosives to fugitives. Working with dogs since 1994, Sergeant Robert Spangler has come to appreciate the animal's ability to pick up where the human senses leave off.
Their sense of smell is 200,000 times to 500,000 times what a human is. And that's basically what they're good for. And if there's any kind of scent there, human or non-human, they're going to pick it up where a human can't, even by looking.
But even Sergeant Spangler had doubts as to whether the dog could detect a body after it had been buried for a year. In March of 1997, he and his dog were brought to Vic's backyard, where he gave his partner the command to search for a human scent. As they approached a pile of wood, he noticed the signs of an alert. The dog was telling them to dig beneath the wood pile. Shortly after they began digging, investigators struck a layer of concrete. Knowing that evidence could be anywhere, they carefully sifted through the soil. As they dug further with their hands, trying not to break the concrete, they realized that the dog had discovered a grave. In the concrete, they could see the outline of a body. Once the cement was carefully removed, they could see the body of a woman wrapped in a sleeping bag and a layer of plastic. The body was sent to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. The medical examiner confirmed through dental records that this was the body of Kathy Beadle. Some snapped cartilage in her neck told her that she died from strangulation. Someone had killed her with his bare hands. That someone, investigators believed, was her husband, Tony Vick. The sheriff's department finally had the evidence they needed to secure an arrest warrant for Tony Vick. But they still didn't know where he was. His photograph and description were entered into the NCIC, a database that connects law enforcement agencies throughout the country. A few days later, Knox County sheriffs received a call. Tony Vick was apprehended for stealing a $100 suit from a store outside of Atlantic City, New Jersey. When police there ran his name through their database, they learned that he was wanted for much more than shoplifting. Detectives theorized that soon after the death of his first wife, Vick had his eye on Kathy, not for her love or companionship, but strictly for her money. The man Kathy came to trust and love soon began plotting her murder. A year before Kathy disappeared, Tony gave Ray and Fleeta Holliday a fax machine. He knew that in order to collect the $8,000 a month Kathy received from her first husband's death, it would need to appear as if she were alive. In April of 1996, after all of the elements of his plan were in place, Tony Vick carried out the murder in the couple's home. After strangling her, he dug a grave, then covered it with concrete, thinking it would conceal his guilt from the world. He then sent faxes to the family in Kathy's name, assuring them that their daughter was alive. But Sergeant Spangler's dog uncovered the truth. Tony Vick was convicted of the first-degree murder of Kathy Beadle and sentenced to life in prison. He was subsequently found guilty of killing his first wife. He received an additional life sentence. When the human senses reach their limit, man's best friend can become a detective's greatest asset. Whether they're used to sniff out arson, track a missing person, or uncover a hidden grave, no rival can beat the dog when it comes to finding the scent of the kill.